Hello everyone, today we talk about the Landsknechten dress. We never made a video about the Landsknechten and we will definitely make more than once in the future. As you know, I just sort picked my topics randomly. This was the first one picked, and the dress ones, I know some of you say, oh my god, these are boring ones. We want army organization, we want tactics, all this, so we will get to it. But still, there are interesting aspects we can draw from things like dress. So, bit of background, what we're talking about. The Landsknechten, so etymologically that's mean Lands is Saxon genitive of the country, basically means, and Knecht would be servant, right? It's the same etymology of knight, actually, and that formed into the sense properly somebody, serving another, a lord. Right, and in fact, as a retinue mostly, so it's an old term, but definitely in Renaissance Germany, what the reality was still pretty much medieval in nature. There were these great principalities, these great territorial seigneuries, if you want, of which the Habsburgs that were essentially coming to monopolize the imperial crown at this point were a bit the emerging power, the greatest power, trying to essentially centralize from, in fact, their position of kings of Germany, of Holy Roman emperors, and therefore trying to cope with the new challenges that a Renaissance battlefield would present with, and more specifically with the creation of professional forces, right? Mercenaries that cost a lot. So we'll see better at some point how this started, how Maximilian I decided to create this force, essentially of German mercenaries, right? They were mostly recruited actually in the northwest of the country. They participated, importantly, think about the Italian wars, but the German as an Habsburg arm, right? But still, the term Landsknecht came to identify, broadly speaking, naturally also what this man did for a living, even outside the imperial service, if you want. As we will see, there are cases, even some of them, such as the Black Legion passing over to the French at some point. So they passed down to history as one of the most iconic, characteristic, flamboyant, I can't say corps properly, but units of the time. They contributed to the detriment of the Swiss system. They also, however, fell out of date as at least a renowned force by the second half of the 16th century. But they're famous enough for their role in the Italian wars. I don't know, think about Pavia or the sack of Rome, the infamous sack of Rome, and also in Germany. They definitely contributed to the military of the local powers. So their equipment is mostly famous. It's mostly iconic, flamboyant, multicolored, very heterogeneous. Right, in this sense, the Landsknechten, as most mercenaries of the time, didn't have a uniformation of their clothes, and specifically, they were probably the furthest from that in all European battlefields. Part of the reason being probably the lack of interest in creating a real uniform at the time, because Habsburgic power was still relatively modest compared to the other great powers in Europe. Still, equipping the Landsknecht costed a lot, so much that the Diet actually complained for the cost of clothing itself. Maximilian at the time saying, this men have a dangerous life, give them pride and a kind of amusement because of their equipment, of their dress, their appearance, which also created some problems, as we will see at the time, because of the obscenity sometimes in their outfit. And we'll see better here. So we can trace here some prototypes of equipment, or at least discussing certain aspects also about armor that maybe we'll see better on another time, but essentially trying to understand what they could look like. Of course, they're The Landsknechten are mostly famous, I would say, for their infantry, because Renaissance warfare, that especially in the first half of the 16th century, was going to be focused on these large squares of pikemen, but they definitely had already, more, right? Landsknecht could be, a knight, an arquebusier, could, they were an army to court, right? So there were different specializations that we will see on the army organization videos. For today, we talk about these outfits. So, for example, Imperial Heralds, right? Several regiments grouped together usually had a herald for their commanding officer that was tasked with this, messenger duties, for example, to the enemy, to contract, to negotiate, all these things. So he would be normally clad in a silk surcoat bearing the embroidered coat of arms of the Obrist. So it's the same word of Oberst, right? Even today, it's the colonel, fundamentally the commander of these regiments, which would be, usually at least, or could be, among others, the imperial double-headed eagle, right? Definitely of the empire, and as a symbol of his peaceful mansion of messenger, fundamentally, he carried a white baton. And we find significant figures also stood out for their own appearance. It was very characteristic. Remember, the background here is still very medieval in mindset, so never think that, we make a lot of videos on this, but that a Renaissance battlefield here would be essentially devoid of those deep, kind of arcane, even primordial, ancestral, even pagan echoing, symbologies that lived in the customs and the traditions of these populations, right? You can imagine what Germany at the beginning of the 16th century was like, especially certain areas of the northeast, right? Actually, Germany was one of the most advanced countries already at the time, but mostly in the rich south, and where, not surprisingly, also the Imperials here were trying to build, in fact, an armed forces like, but these were mostly peasants, right? These were literally, in the modern age, you have properly this capacity of great sovereigns to give money, to submit contract or recruitment, and then the officials received it to hire literally everybody, right? And this was starting to be systematically, in modern age, the scum of society, right? Modern armies were fundamentally composed by not much of a knightly elite with, a bunch of territorial militias, but fundamentally of, essentially everybody who could decide better to serve in an army than keeping to live in miserable conditions than they would. So we're talking about a moment of great intensification, also of warfare, of resources invested. So, participating to this wars was something terrifying. And the 16th century was by far, in spite of, we try to picture it as the Renaissance, but it was by far one of the single most radically violent centuries in the history of mankind. It was dramatic, it was destroyed. Even talking about Germany, think about the Reformation, the confessional clashes starting here, the peasants' revolts. I mean, there are these big systemic agitations that release an astonishing amount of violence at levels that are very difficult even to picture sometimes, and it's definitely fascinating. Nobody had ever seen, let's say, the sheer size of armies were fielded at the time of the Italian wars. The French now were starting to put pretty much under pressure the rest of Europe. From the other side, the Ottomans as well. So the Habsburgs also had this political and strategical task to oppose adequate forces at that point. And fortunately for them, they had Spain now as well. But still, the empire provided this fine, hard, harsh, robust professionals that would pass a bit to history, and also for their dark fame. And an astonishing figure in here is Gail Von Friendsberg, the commander of the Landsknecht that eventually descended into Italy in 1527, the sack of Rome. He actually had an apoplectic stroke. He came back to Tyrol, where he was from. But I don't know, this was the guy who stood in front of French cavalry charges in front of the Landsknechten, in their ranks, in the first rank, with the banner of the empire, right? Just to tell you, kind of, psychologically speaking, what kind of profile could be behind these minds. People of fanatic courage, right? And he would. We mention him, if anything, because of also his appearance, that he showed at the service as a faithful servant of the Habsburgs, and he continually wore the Imperial Field Recognition sign, right, which was a red sash, right. Also, he was noted for his Roman-styled helmet and the halberd, which he bore with distinction. Here we could digress on also what it meant for men of the state. He was a nobleman from Tyrol. He wasn't even such a great figure politically speaking. But let's say this idea of still the nobleman had to be fundamentally a warrior in nature, and also the various fashions that now were spreading ever more, in Europe, intertwining all the various countries, military cultures. Here we will see the Roman-styled helmet is typical, let's say it's a classical echo of the times, of the obsession for the ancients. The halberd reveals in itself also the dramatic training capacities, because it's a very versatile weapon that has essentially three functions: piercing, fracturing, and cutting. It requires an important training. And the red sash it was a specific. It was basically together with a red cross, the one of Burgundy, right? The same one would pass to Spain fundamentally because of the same reason, because of the Burgundian inheritance of the Habsburgs. Would be basically the only uniform element, at least used as such. Many also didn't wear it, but usually we wore armor. Especially the officers, etc., wore a red sash in recognition, whereas the regular troopers would mostly go with a red cross in the front, right? And also, there are other fascinating figures in here. Armor is also an important point, because the creator of the Landsknechten himself, Emperor Maximilian I, was, as you know, the inventor of let's say a modern type of armor that takes its name, that was designed at the time. It's very, very elite, the Maximilian one. It's typical, let's say, of the German, Austrian design that was dominated between the years 1500 and 1530, especially north of the Alps. It was characterized by the multiple grooves and flutings, which afforded both ornamentation and greater protection. Right, the Maximilian armor was designed to be literally, the best you could field against increasing danger posed by firearms on the field. So naturally, this was an elite thing. But naturally, Landsknechten commanders would be equipped with such armor. The large battle type retained a Gothic outline and was, as we've seen, festooned with the imperial device. This showed consistently the two-headed eagle, the coats of Burgundy. There were also other, for example, the Tyrolean eagles were shown also because of the Tyrolean possessions of the Habsburgs. And generally speaking, this armor would remain the most characteristic the first time. However, let's say decaying mostly in functionality, we would say, because, as you know, armor went on for a consistent time, but gradually was largely more abandoned in terms of sheer quantity, adaptation on the field. Since they fought in the front rank, as we've seen in the case of Friendsberg, the Hauptleute, so the captains proper of the Landsknechten, were usually armored. Right, this was the deal. The guys in the front ranks for defending themselves from blows, both from missile and white steel, would be armor, and captains on the fore had to be for their vital function, obviously enough. So Maximilian armor would be worn, right? Surely also on foot, with all its ornamental flutings, let's say. And later on, however, armor evolved into the so-called Trabanech. That came, you see, the Trabaner were also specific figures in the retinue of the same captains. So I check whether there is, I presume so, a direct connection between the two terms. I mean, that type of retinue and its equipment, which was essentially a trotting armor, was a lighter form of protection with more rounded articulations, wider arm guards, and shoulder pieces that, especially in infantry combat, probably gave some advantage in movement. Headgear among the Landsknecht and sometimes among their commanders could be this felt beret with a basin-shaped crown and a wide brim. Right. Initially, we don't see much pictures properly even of head armor. Right. We know the Landsknechten could have mail cape or shirt, but not much heavier gear usually, right? And eventually things got happening towards the second half of the 16th century. Which was the reason? Well, I don't know. The German mercenaries suffered of this sometimes on European battlefield. You know that these troops would be hired also frequently by the English at some point, or the Scots even. They fought sometimes against longbows, and they suffered importantly in the first half of the 16th century because of these hits. The reason probably being that the square blocks didn't quite need much equipment, rather collective training. So in terms of resources, it was better for these guys to have a tough cohesion and drill, etc., to move as an effective force, punching one on the battlefields. At this point, infantries advanced to attack properly. They were quite aggressive. The Landsknechten also had their complement of swordsmen with Zweihänder and the famous Doppelsöldner that were literally the double pay, forlorn hope type of elite troops that would be thrown into the midst of the fray in the most atrocious moments, their task being literally even to create massive gaps within the enemy pikemen by swirling their double-handed swords, and mostly also getting killed in a high number, and that's exactly where their greatest rewards came from. But the rest of the infantry, especially the one of the corps of the posterior ranks, wouldn't need to spend money for their protection, right? The best guys were on the outer sides and exposed to enemy fire, but then yes, if an artillery shot struck into the midst of the troops, armor wouldn't spare them more than much. So at the end of the day, in terms of cost-benefit ratio, probably that's how the thing went. And this is pretty universal. Like you see, I mean, European infantry becomes heavier, more armored towards the second half of the 16th century. So that's basically the same deal with the German mercenaries, who also, however, as we've seen, wore a consistent part of armor, usually chest plates, right? But for the rest, being mostly unarmored, they had these curious outfits. And the felt beret was quite iconic, especially very heavily plumeted, very colorful, and so on. And often it was cut at regular intervals all around, sometimes turned back to form stiff loops, right? Had these bright feathers, ruffled wool. Were interesting figures such as, for example, the skull ties that was an officer deputed to the local recruitment on a territorial base, because naturally the Habsburgs were trying to impose this service more, also on a territorial level, and he, so the Skultais was also sort of magistrate, public dignitary. He usually would wear the chain of office, the staff, a form of boar spear, which is probably the forerunner of the officer's spontoon. The troops could wear as headgear also the calotte, a sort of skull cap that was usually made of cheesecloth or thin linen, decorated with slashing. And the purpose of the calotte was to keep both hair and hat in place, right? But originally it was a type of hair net worn by the women folk. Also for officers, other distinguished figures, there was the Italian vogue of the tunic, right? Typically worn by officers, this Renaissance style, members of the nobility, right? And also the mounted troops, as a sign of distinction. Speaking of hairstyle, also in here the Landsknecht distinguished themselves in a sense, but also they were influenced by other foreign fashion, because at the beginning of the period, even if you look at the same fashion of the same hairstyle of Maximilian I, still kind of the medieval, French-derived ideal of long hair and shaved face was the norm, right? Then eventually the typical Landsknecht beard, right, sometimes grossly long and cultivated, was actually a Spanish trend, right? So the hair too was cut, right, and these exaggeratedly long beards were also arranged necessarily in different ways. For example, there was an Austrian by the name of Andreas von Rauber who allegedly let his beard grow to the ground, and in order to fight with it, he had to tie it around his waist. Also, we know of the Oberst Graf Eitelfritz von Hohenzollern, who plaited his beard, right, from his chin downwards, literally. This was a kind of a sign of distinction, let's say, within the Imperial Habsburgic field, we would say. For the rest, we have seen the red sash, the red cross, and also the red cross was one of the field signs for Imperial troops, and sometimes, as we were saying before, was sewn onto the doublet. Also, the Swiss wore a cross, but this was white, right? So that's the Swiss would wear also similar colors. So when they clashed against the Germans, they distinguished themselves from each other mostly from between red and white. Also, the Forlorn Hope units of the Landsknechten brought the so-called Blutfahne standard. So literally the blood flag, right? So that it's pretty, evocative what function they carried out. This is speaking still of the red. It recurred as basically the only color ever witnessed for an attempt of uniformation. From the Willibald Pirkheimer regiment in 1529. Willibald Pirkheimer was a patrician from Nuremberg who had, decided to invest in the business of mercenarism, and he basically created. He made I think the only attempt of uniformity at the time for the Landsknecht, and for a regiment raised in that year, fitting out with red jerkins and hose, red being, however, also the heraldic color of Nuremberg, right? And in general, red, that since ancient times, it conceals blood wounds well, so it doesn't it can have that advantage as well, but we don't have to be too functionalistic about it. These troopers would wear, I don't know, a normal shirt gathered at the neck with full sleeves that were pulled out through the slashes in the puffed out jerkin. And about the origin of the slashing that is very typical of the Landsknecht, and well, it probably has to do with an adaptation of the typical 16th century civilian costume that, as you know, at the time, uniforms did not quite exist. There were some attempts here and there, but it was completely, let's say, the civilian costume was extremely unsuitable for fighting in a way. It would create many problems, even literally of movement sometimes. In fact, this consisted in an oversized shirt, often gathered at the neck, and with the hose and double tight-fitting, restricting movement at the joints. So what these soldiers did was basically converting it into their own uniform. And the first step was to split open the jerkin at the elbows and shoulders, right, for greater mobility at the joints, at the top, and the hose at the knees and hips for the same function. So they eventually compensated for this kind of ripped costume by adding strips of ribbons tying around the arms, and the shirt was pulled through the jerkin in bunches, and so they acquired a quite characteristic look, but at the same time more greater movement in action. Other, I don't know, arquebusiers would have, for example, a leather pouch for the 4-foot long match used at the time that could be sometimes also hung from the belt on the right of the hand side, but I don't know, when it was raining they had to put it under their beret or things like that. So eventually the invention of the cartridge case in the latter half of the 16th century kind of improved the situation with a faster loading procedure. As we were saying before, the Landsknecht didn't display so much armor, right? There was also the saying that a true Landsknecht never wore a backplate because he would never turn his back on the enemy. More, let's say, realistically, this was simply because they couldn't afford the full armor most of the times, and they could still, however, functionally protect better to people with just a frontal doublet in combat than having it to with a protection in their back. Also because, I mean, if you keep maintaining formation, you're turned towards the enemy. So in the square, unless you were surrounded in some way, you wouldn't get much fire from the rear, and if it broke, right, you would be cut down anyway. So at that point, the armor could even be a hindrance, and because you had to run pretty fast. Equally, the left leg was often left bare, right, so that the pike drill could be carried out with greater dexterity. Sometimes this was carried to the extreme with the buttocks being completely exposed, right? And the hose were sometimes slashed in the upper part and striped in the lower one. The legs were sometimes also different colors and decorated in various ways with piping stripes and spiral bands. Otherwise, so one leg could be left bare, naked. So, as we've seen, there was basically no uniformity whatsoever. So the most grotesque and extreme things could be found eventually because, let's say, the German fashion spread also among other troops, so that sometimes you say, oh, look, these are the Landsknechten, but they're really not. Sometimes they're foreigners, right? But the most extreme outfits were definitely from Germany on average. And during the 16th century, as we've seen, armor changed. A complete set could have weighed between 40 and 50 pounds. So it was necessary to make it ever more articulate, and so on. But by 1530, the Maximilian-style armor, as we've seen, had already disappeared. So also the breastplate began to assume a more curved shape, and the neck piece was replaced by a collar with a gorget, which was articulated in a lobster fashion. So were the upper arm sections and gauntlets, which had jointed fingers. Also, the saddlery improved consistently. It was, at the beginning of the century, it had essentially been ironed with the cantle fitted into its mountings. In the latter part of the century, instead was made of wood and leather reinforced with iron. Right, so this gave actually much more freedom of movement and comfort as well. Also, horse armor changed. This may not be so crucial, but that Maximilian armor also contemplated best plate armor for the horse as well, which was a radically expensive thing. Like numerically, these troops were inconsistent for how much they costed, but say they even here there are changes. The same horse armor begins to display over time greater articulation, especially with the three-piece hinged pectoral or pectoral buckled to the main piece by means of leather straps. There were also some bulbous ornamentation on the pectoral that was thought to deflect a bit the lance blows. So a bit was in practice the shape of armor in general, right, to have a more deflect. Among the German mercenaries, we see also these large and cumbersome drums. There is also all a musical tradition, in my opinion, in the West has been dramatically overlooked over the East. This we see for the sake of, say, of color here that the drums carried the imperial motive usually, right? So either the double-headed eagle or the Burgundian crossed staves and fiery devices. Speaking specifically of the iconic Pluderhose, so this huge baggy hose that the Landsknecht appear mostly in the second half of the 16th century, in fact dates back to 1553. Right? It first appeared in the camp of Prince Maurice of Saxony while besieging Magdeburg, and the clergy, when they saw this Pluderhose, they basically banned, right? So it came to the point that there was a certain Musculus who was a court priest at Berlin who wrote a treatise on the subject, specifically complaining that the hose was doing more to expose the anatomy than hiding it, since it was divided at the hips by a huge and often obscene codpiece in the form of a bow of slashed material. Right, so much that the Landsknechten that were caught in the early days wearing the Pluderhose would be incarcerated because of public indecency. The hose consisted essentially of yards of material held up by slashed bands suspended from the waist at the front and rear. And this would gradually become, said, more typical. In the mid of the century, also the costume had undergone other transformations, mostly by Spanish influence. Beards became ever more pointed. The wide slashed beret gave way to a much smaller version, or preferably for the worse safety, to a helmet, either a morion or the bourgogne. And the latter had specifically hinged cheek pieces, often an additional faceplate known as a beaver. And the morion instead were a simple open helmet, and usually the arquebusiers had to be lighter, also in movement, etc. preferred it. Doublets were prone to extensive vertical slashing at this point. The shirt was ruffled at neck and cuffs in typical Spanish fashion. The footwear began to cover the wall instead this point. In the earlier period, instead, there was very eccentric type of shoe called Kuhmäule, right, cow's mouth. It was very popular in the early days, but the open instep and elaborate toe section was quite impractical, especially on muddy terrain. So we could conclude talking about the Black Legion or Black Bands. These were troops who had basically passed over the French after the imperial defeat at Ravenna in 1512, right, when Gaston de Foix died, etc. And at that time, Maximilian had issued, as usual, to all the Germans to come back home, right? Instead, these 800 Landsknecht entered in French service, and they were under the command of the Duke of Gueldre at this point, and they became famous because, as the name says, they wore black jerkins and hose, and also their armored element was blackened by fire to avoid rusting, so they finally perished, were exterminated at Pavia in 1525. Important Imperial German-Spanish victory over the French. Then here I've inserted a lot of pictures that show, for example, the saddleresses that are quite of a fascinating figure. We were talking about them in I don't remember which video about modern warfare. You go in modern warfare playlist or Renaissance warfare, you will find that, but I don't know. It's not specifically about them. But let's say these figures were important because Renaissance armies were ever larger, and was all this train of civilians, right? And of and many women. This is very well documented. It often happened in the case of the German mercenaries, followed regularly specific men sometimes for years, even 10 years. They would be they were considered whores as they did it professionally, so they would be the companions, etc. But they would have actually an interesting and important role in, if not in combat, let's say, but in the proximities of it. Like they were meant to support their own men. So these women had dramatically very tough time. They're basically the female correspondent of this kind of scum of societies that made the armies of the time, and it was a way of living. It was a specific lifestyle. They managed to make money through it and to have a living. But you have to imagine even the feelings, the true loves and relationships and children, right, that stem from it. And this is kind of characters. I would like to read more about that, meaning, the culture that revolved around it, in the sense that they're a bit typical of the imperial troops, the German troops specifically, and I'm sure there are many anthropological aspects to notice here. And the saddler trained, there were also men, however, among the sattlers, and they were mostly merchants, right? So they were the ones to supply the army, that managed the plunder. So those who monetized, made the business out of this. But they often also caused trouble, so much that the provosts were deputed to keep an eye on them, because hagging produced often brawls in the camps, right? So this wasn't much about, it happened also among the soldiers, but literally, the least agitations also among the civilians, especially in the supply train, the better it was, right? So we'll be talking about the troops' discipline on another occasion. It was ferocious, right? Because these were real professionals of war, so they had, as all professionals of war, the most radically abusive, traumatic, and violent forms of training, and in times where, in fact, the state did not quite exist, and these were definitely a ferocious bunch. But for now, we will stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.